The first wrong thing wasn't the blue lights, it was how quiet his daughter went, like someone had pressed a mute button inside her chest. Adrian noticed it even before the chirp of the siren. 1 second Naya was humming a crooked version of Twinkle, Twinkle. The next she was staring at her own reflection in the window, lips parted just enough to let fear in. He followed her gaze to the rearview mirror and caught a flicker, blue, then gone, like lightning deciding whether to announce itself. He checked the speedometer, 32 in a 35, and signaled anyway, sliding over to give the cruiser room to pass. It didn't. It tucked in close enough that he could read the scuffs on the push bar, the ghost of dried bugs. The chirp came again, 2 quick notes that didn't howl as much as they tapped him on the shoulder. "Daddy," Naya said, and her voice had that brittle high edge that lives between a question and a cry. "Are we in trouble?" "No," he said, "because that is where you start." His hand stayed at 10 and 2, the steering wheel warm under his palms. "We're okay." He guided the car to the curb just past a shuttered florist with papered windows. A hand-lettered sign still clung to the glass, "Back in 10." Someone had taped it there months ago and never found their way back. He put the car in park, turned off the engine, and waited with the patience of a man who had counted other people's breaths at 2 in the morning. The hospital badge clipped to his collar tugged at his neck when he swallowed. The smell of cut strawberries drifted up from the Tupperware in the cup holder on the passenger side. Naya's lesson snack, sweet and a little wet, like summer refusing to leave. "Driver, hands where I can see them." The voice was right there at the window, hot and clipped. Adrian lifted his fingers on the wheel an inch higher, letting his wrists rest lightly against the air. He didn't turn his head yet. He had learned not to rush a moment like this. Movement layered on movement is how things explode. "My hands are visible," he said, and kept his tone flat on purpose. "My daughter is in the back seat. I'm going to reach for her." "Do not reach." Close to a snap. The man stepped forward so the brim of his hat shadowed his eyes. White, mid-30s, jaw set like it had been trained to lock in emergencies and hadn't come unlocked since. The nameplate flashed and hid behind the window glare. His right hand hovered over the holster in a way that looked casual from far away and like a lit fuse up close. Naya shifted in her booster and the buckle clicked. "Dad." "It's all right, Bean," Adrian said, and the small nickname steadied him more than it steadied her. "We're just talking." The officer's breath left a small ghost on the glass. "Where are you coming from?" "Eastbrook Medical," he said. "I'm a physician there. My badge is license and registration." "My wallet is in my right jacket pocket," Adrian said, stating each word like a landmark on a trail. "The registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to move slowly." The officer's fingers tightened on nothing. "One hand," he said. "Right hand for the wallet. Do not move your left hand." "My right hand only," Adrian repeated. He brought his fingers off the wheel deliberately, watched them like they belonged to someone else, and slid them into his pocket. Leather. He pulled the wallet out and pinched his license free with those sticky strawberry-scented fingertips, then offered it through the narrow gap at the top of the lowered window. The officer took it without looking, eyes never leaving Adrian's. A muscle twitched at the corner of his mouth. "Registration." "In the glove box," Adrian said, then added, "He couldn't help it. If you're more comfortable, you can open it yourself. There's a black folder with the paperwork inside." The officer hesitated, suspicion and procedure wrestling behind his sunglasses. "Unlock it," he said. Adrian tapped the button near his knee. The soft thunk of the locks made Naya flinch. The officer leaned across the passenger seat, his duty belt scraping vinyl with a sound like teeth, and popped the glove box. A neat stack of papers slid forward. On top of the registration sat a trifold agenda from City Hall, creased where Adrian had folded it into his coat earlier that afternoon. He hadn't meant to leave it in the car, but he'd scooped up Naya in the hospital lobby, distracted by the text from Maya, "Traffic's a mess. Can you do drop-off? You're the hero if you save us from Ms. Allen's frown," and the agenda had ended up stuffed with the insurance card and a pack of wipes. The officer plucked out the registration without touching the agenda, as if paperwork had temperature and one sheet might burn. He shut the glove box and stepped back into the raw daylight, license and registration in one hand, the other hand returning naturally, lazily, to rest where fear lives. "Signal violation," he said. "And your left taillight is out." "I used my signal," Adrian said, then forced himself to let it go. "Argument is gasoline. I had the taillight replaced last week," he added, as neutrally as he could. "I have the receipt in that same folder." The officer's jaw clicked. "Step out of the vehicle." Naya's inhale stuttered, a little bird trapped. Adrian felt his body split. One part of him moving, cooperative, trained by fathers and uncles and barbershop conversations to keep the temperature down. The other part wanting to wrap himself around the small person in the back seat and fuse into the car door. He opened the door slowly, both hands visible, and stepped into the late afternoon. The air was cool and thin. The city had pulled the heat higher where the clouds couldn't get to it. He kept the driver's door open just enough that he could still see Naya's eyes in the side mirror. They were too large for her face in moments like this. She had skipped a tooth in front last week, and it made her look younger and older at the same time. "Face the vehicle," the officer said. "Hands on the hood." "My daughter is 8, Adrian said, not moving his hands yet, trying to find the version of his voice that made human beings turn human again. "She's afraid. I will keep my hands visible at all times. I am not a threat to you." The officer's mouth tightened. "Hands." "The hood." Adrian placed his palms gently on the metal. Warm from the drive, textured with dust. He kept his fingers splayed, wedding ring flashing once like a signal of its own. "Sir?" Naya's voice was smaller now, formal in the way kids get when they think politeness might save them. Can I close my eyes?" "Yes," he said without turning. "Close your eyes and count to 100. Slow." Her counting started immediately, whisper thin. 1, 2, 3. The officer shifted his weight. "Do you consent to a search of the vehicle?" "No," Adrian said. He felt the word settle into the air with surprising weight. "I do not consent to a search." "You refusing because you have something to hide?" "I'm refusing because my child is in the back seat and because I'm aware of my rights," Adrian said, careful not to lace the sentence with anything that could be mistaken, on paper or on a recording, for contempt. "If you have probable cause, say so. If you do not, please don't put your hand on your gun while my daughter is learning what adults do under stress." A muscle jumped near the officer's temple. "Keep your tone respectful, sir." "I am," Adrian said. Across the street, a woman walking a stroller slowed but didn't stop. Her eyes flicked from the badge to the little face in the back seat to Adrian's open hands. She moved on, and the guilt that came with watching and not intervening hung in the air like a smell no one would admit. 7, Naya whispered. Her voice broke on 20. The sound made something hot and metallic flare behind Adrian's breastbone. The radio on the officer's shoulder crackled. White noise, then a voice, and his head tilted, listening. Adrian couldn't make out the words from where he stood, but he heard the cadence shift. The officer's eyes flicked to the license he still held, then to Adrian's face, then back to the license. He glanced at the car again as if something inside it might inform him who he had pulled over. Adrian saw the exact moment recognition tugged at the corner of the officer's mouth and didn't land. A half frown, a pause, a recalculation. It wasn't recognition of him, not yet. Adrian's face wasn't famous, and he had no illusions about that, but of the name, perhaps, or the hospital badge, or the kind of person who declined a search calmly and did not move his left hand an inch. The officer swallowed. "What's in the back seat besides your daughter?" "Her violin," Adrian said. "A math worksheet. A sweater with stars on it because she thinks her teacher keeps her classroom too cold. The receipt for a taillight repair in the glove compartment you just opened." The officer stared at him for a heartbeat too long. The radio crackled again, louder this time, and Adrian caught a crumb of a phrase. "Unit 4, confirm, protocol, stand by." His name can be heavy in predictable rooms, clinic waiting areas, hospital elevators, city hall conference spaces where his voice had learned how to carry policy without breaking. Hearing it in broken radio language on a street with a shuttered florist made it feel like a different object entirely. 47, 48. Naya's counting faltered, then soldiered on. Adrian forced his shoulders to soften, as if his body could feed the air something gentle to breathe. He could feel his phone vibrating in his pocket. Maya, almost certainly, asking if they'd made it to Ms. Allen's on time, but he didn't reach for it. One hand still on the hood, the other hovering an inch above it as agreed, he watched the officer's gaze detach from his face and drift, briefly, to the small outline of a child framed by a car window. The hand on the holster flexed, then loosened. "Sir," the officer said after a too long hesitation that let panic imagine futures, "I'm going to write you a warning for failure to signal." "I signaled," Adrian said softly. "But if the choice is between a warning and you keeping your hand off your weapon, I'll take the warning." The officer flinched like the words had been thrown. He stepped back, the license and registration hitching in his grip, then turned toward his cruiser. He walked like a man realizing, for the first time, that his feet had been doing most of his thinking. Adrian exhaled through his nose. He kept his eyes on Naya. Her lips were moving now without sound. He could tell she'd lost her count and was pretending she hadn't. He wanted to open the door, slide in, tuck her hair behind her ear, kiss the top of her head, and say something that would bind this moment in gauze and keep infection out. He stood with his hand on the hood instead. A neighbor 2 houses down lifted a phone and pointed it in their direction. Adrian felt the complicated gratitude of it, the way a camera could be both net and knife, and the pressure of performing survival correctly in case an audience arrived. The officer reached his cruiser, opened the door, and paused, head bent toward the radio. This time the words came clean across the street, mechanical and human at once. "Unit 42, be advised, plate registered to Adrian Cole. Cross-check, Civilian Police Accountability Board membership." The afternoon air shifted the way air does a half-second before a storm starts. A hush as if the city had taken a breath and decided to hold it. The officer's head rose. He looked back at Adrian as if the name had turned him 40 degrees inside his own body. For a beat, his face was unreadable, a page caught between chapters. Then his shoulders drew back, not in aggression but in a different tension entirely, the kind that shows up when a man realizes the rules of the room have rearranged themselves while he wasn't looking. He closed his car door without getting in, walked back with the license and registration in his hand, and stopped a yard away. He opened his mouth, shut it, opened it again. Naya had reached 98. She whispered, 99, like it might be the last number that ever existed. "Dr. Cole," the officer said, and Adrian felt his first name vanish from the encounter like mist. Naya said, 100, and when the word left her, it sounded like a prayer that didn't know if it worked. The officer's eyes flicked to the back seat again. His hand came off the holster and hovered uselessly in the air, almost like he'd been caught mid-salute and didn't know what to do with it now. "Please step back to the curb," he said, voice suddenly softer in the wrong places. "I'll return your documents." Adrian didn't move immediately. He knew enough about power to recognize the moment it tripped over itself. He wasn't ready to pick it up for the officer. He lifted his palms, still open, still patient, and took one step, then another, stopping where the cracked edge of the sidewalk met a strip of grass gone to straw. He could feel the words forming in the officer's throat before they arrived. He could feel the way the day was about to tilt, strange, nauseating, almost comic if it wasn't happening in front of a child who would carry the shape of it like a watermark on her memory. "Sir," the officer began, and this time his voice broke where pride lives. The radio hissed again, and the voice from it flattened into instruction, "Unit 42, keep it by the book." The pause. "And make sure your body cam is on." Adrian finally turned his head and looked the man in the face, not as a threat and not as a savior. He saw a jaw that had been clenching for years and a flicker behind the eyes. Fear, yes, but also recognition of something that had nothing to do with title. Recognition of a father with his hands on a hood while a girl did math with her breath. The officer held the license out with fingers that wanted to, absurdly, apologize. "Here," he said. Just that. The word everyone uses when they don't know how to carry the heavier one. Adrian took it. The plastic was warm from a stranger's hand. Naya's eyes found his in the mirror, wet and defiant, and he made his mouth do the smallest thing, lift at one corner, so she could borrow some courage and pretend it was hers. The officer swallowed. The street held its breath. Somewhere a wind chime did the nervous laughing we do when a conversation goes sideways in a living room. A car in the distance honked once like a reminder that the world, indifferent and busy, didn't intend to stop for long. "Ms. Allen is going to be mad I'm late," Naya whispered, more to herself than to him. Adrian kept his gaze on the officer and spoke to his daughter anyway. "I know," he said. "We'll tell her we learned something on the way." What exactly they were about to learn, about fear, about rules, about which adults remember how to be one, was the part that sat in the space between them now, heavy and invisible. The officer wet his lips. He looked at Adrian's hospital badge, then at the folded paper peeking from the glove box seam, the city hall agenda he'd accidentally left behind, and the shape of the day sharpened behind his eyes. "Dr. Cole," he tried again, and this time the word that wanted to come out first gathered in his throat like a swallowed stone. "Please." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The plea hung there anyway, raw and bare, a strange and dangerous thing. The plea hung there like a rope thrown across a river with no bridge, frayed and wavering, asking to be grabbed by the very man who had been told to stand still. The officer's mouth stayed open as if another sentence might step through, then closed, then opened again, a door that did not know whether it was welcome to move. Adrian did not answer immediately. He listened to his pulse settle into a slower drum, not calm yet, only disciplined. His palms lifted from the hood an inch, enough to show he had heard the tone change, not enough to make anyone jump. He angled his body so he could see both the uniform and the reflection of his daughter's face in the side mirror. She had stopped counting. Her eyes were too wide for the size of her head. "Sir," the officer tried again, voice dropping into a register that didn't match the stance of a man with authority. I'm going to return your documents and give you a warning. There's no need to escalate this. I don't want any trouble for you or your daughter." Adrian's jaw tightened. The sentence wasn't cruel, but it wasn't kind either. It was cowardice dressed up as mercy. He held his ground and let the silence lengthen until the officer had to feel what everyone else felt, the weight of how a thing sounds when you say it out loud. From behind them, a second cruiser eased to the curb, not with a rush but with the cautious roll of someone arriving to steady, not to show off. The door opened and a woman in a sergeant's stripes stepped out, her posture a straight line from the soles of her boots to the set of her mouth. She took in the scene the way a good clinician reads a room, one sweep for danger, a second for damage that isn't obvious, a third for whatever can still be saved. "What we got?" she asked without raising her voice. The officer stiffened and turned his body a few degrees toward her while keeping Adrian within the edge of his vision. "Failure to signal. Left tail light up. Driver refused consent to a vehicle search." The sergeant's eyes moved to the car, paused on the tiny face in the back seat, then found Adrian's hands, open, steady, visible. She stepped toward the rear window and crouched slightly, lowering herself until her eyes were nearly level with Naya's. "Hey there," she said gently. "I'm Sergeant Ramirez. I see the violin. You play?" The uniform looked different on her. It did not erase her face. Naya nodded once, the motion barely more than a tremor. "My teacher quit after 10 days when I tried the cello," Ramirez said, a small scrap of truth offered like a blanket. "I was very loud and very bad. If I hold my badge like a conductor's wand, can you give me a little thumbs up to tell me you're okay right now?" A thin thumb rose and hovered, then committed to the gesture. Adrian felt something inside his chest unclench a fraction, not relief exactly, but oxygen. Ramirez stood, turned to the officer, and kept her voice professional. "You got the paperwork?" The officer raised the license and registration in a hand that had stopped pretending it didn't shake. "Yes." The driver has his hospital badge on his collar. The plate pinged the board. Ramirez did not look surprised. She did not smile either. "Okay," she said evenly. "We're going to do this by the book. You'll return his documents. You'll issue a verbal warning if that's the lane you've chosen. You will take your hand off your gun and keep it off while a child is in the vehicle. After that, the stop is concluded." A muscle near the officer's jaw leaped. For the first time he looked fully at Adrian, really at him, not at the silhouette of a body shaped by suspicion. His mouth opened again and the rope came out, this time without any covering at all. "Sir, please don't file a complaint," he said, the words too fast, the syllables crashing into each other. "I'll make this right. I have a kid on the way. I can't." He stopped because his voice had found the place where it breaks in front of strangers. "Please," he said, quieter, the way people say it when they have run out of better strategies. Ramirez's head snapped toward him. "Riker," she said in a tone that carried a reprimand and a rescue. "Enough." So his name had a shape now. Riker. It fit the angle of his shoulders and the stubborn set of his mouth. It sounded like a man who had learned the wrong lessons and repeated them until they felt like truth. Adrian took the license and registration when they were offered. The plastic of the card was warm from someone else's hand. He slid everything back into the folder on the passenger seat and, because dignity is a habit, closed the glove compartment with the smallest push of his fingertips. "My daughter is 8, he said, turning to Riker but pitching his voice so both officers could hear. "She is trying to figure out how adults make choices. She will remember what your hands did today long after you forget my name. I will be filing a complaint. Not to end your career. To make sure the system you work in stops rewarding this kind of stuff." Riker started to speak, swallowed, and tried again. "I overreacted," he managed. I was trained to." He looked at Ramirez as if she might hand him a sentence that would sound like an apology and an argument at the same time. "She didn't. You were trained to keep people safe," Ramirez said, words measured and edged. "Start there." Naya made a small sound in the back seat, not a sob, not a word, something that belonged only to children who are holding a scream like it might bite them. Adrian opened the driver's door and crouched so his face was level with hers. "Beans, are you with me?" She nodded. She had not let go of the violin case. Her knuckles were chalk white where her fingers gripped the handle. "Do we still go to Miss Allen's?" she whispered, as if the lesson were a law that might give the universe back its shape. "We do," he said. "We finish what we started." He stood and faced Ramirez. "Sergeant, may I ask you to step closer to the car while I get in and buckle my seatbelt? I don't want my daughter to feel like she's in a spotlight alone." "Of course," Ramirez said, and moved into the space where protection is not only a slogan. She kept her hands visible too, a model of the thing she was about to require of others. Adrian slid into the seat, buckled up, and rested his hands on the wheel again. He glanced at the rearview mirror and gave Naya the faintest smile he could manage, which is to say a real one. She inhaled raggedly and matched his breath on purpose, one of their silly tricks from nights when thunder had felt like a stranger outside her window. "Dr. Cole," Riker said, and the title sat between them like a piece of furniture neither knew where to place. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I let fear do my thinking. I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm asking you to not take everything from me. My wife's due in December. We can't." He blinked hard and the panic in his eyes made him look young in a way that was almost unbearable. Adrian kept his voice level. "I am not interested in taking your livelihood. I am interested in taking your reflex and throwing it in the trash." Riker flinched like the sentence had landed exactly where it needed to. "I'll do training," he said quickly, the words tripping over themselves. "Buy his stuff. The escalation. Whatever the board wants. I'll sit in a room and listen to anyone you say I have to listen to. I'll show you I can." "Riker," Ramirez warned, softer this time, like she knew desperation when she heard it because she'd had to tame her own once. "Stop negotiating with fear." He nodded without moving his head, a motion that looked like an apology to his own face. Adrian turned the key. The engine came alive with a muted cough. He kept the car in park. "Sergeant," he said, "does your department have a protocol for stops with children present?" "We will," Ramirez said. It wasn't a boast. It was a promise from someone who sounded tired of carrying promises for people who didn't keep them. "Good," he said. "Because whatever you think you know about risk, a child in a car changes the math." Something in Riker's posture softened, not defensiveness, not surrender, just the moment when a person realizes the other person isn't here to humiliate them. He looked at the car, at the booster seat, at the small sneakers braced against the floor mat, and then at his own hand as if he were meeting it for the first time. "I can't ask you for anything," he said, voice rough. "But I'm asking anyway. Please, when you write it up, tell them I didn't put hands on you. Tell them I backed off. Tell them I remembered how to be a person eventually. Not first, but eventually." Adrian let the words land where they deserved. "I will write the truth," he said. "All of it." Riker nodded again, the motion jerky, like his body was still learning how to move without a script. "Thank you," he said, barely above a whisper, and for the first time since he'd walked up to the window, his hand fell away from the holster and stayed away as if it finally understood it wasn't needed here. Ramirez stepped back, giving the car a respectful 3 feet. "You're free to go, Dr. Cole," she said. "I'm sorry this interaction added fear to your day." Adrian didn't say thank you because it wasn't the right currency. He inclined his head and shifted into drive. As he signaled and pulled out, Naya's hand floated into the space between the seats. He reached back and squeezed, a quick squeeze, the kind that says I see you and we are still held together by more than luck. They drove 2 blocks in silence broken only by the soft thrum of tires and the violin case clasp ticking against the seat with each small bump. At the 3rd block, at a light that always took too long, Naya spoke, her voice careful like it might break if she pushed it. "Did we do something wrong?" "No," he said, keeping his eyes forward because he didn't trust his face not to betray what it costs to say that word out loud. "We did not." "Will Miss Allen be mad we're late?" "She might be annoyed," he said, the corners of his mouth giving in a little. "But she'll get over it when you make her favorite note sound like a glass of water." Naya's breath made a small laugh that wasn't exactly a laugh. "She likes E," she said, then added, softer, "I don't like the policeman's eyes." "You don't have to," he said. "You only have to remember that your eyes tell the truth too." They turned onto Oak and the rhythm of the neighborhood resumed, trash cans aligned like soldiers, a boy dragging a scooter with the resignation of the recently grounded, a dog looking as if it had just remembered its own name after a long nap. Normal had the gall to exist. At the curb in front of Miss Allen's house, Adrian put the car in park and let his hands fall into his lap before he realized they were trembling. He looked back. "Do you want me to walk you in or do you want to go by yourself?" She thought about it, small brow furrowing, then unclicked the belt and opened the case. "By myself," she said, voice slightly steadier, as if the weight of the instrument reminded her that she had work to do that belonged only to her. She lifted the violin like a fragile promise and cracked the door. Halfway out, she pivoted back, leaned forward, and pressed her forehead to his temple for 1 second, an 8-year-old's benediction. "Count to 100 while I'm inside," she whispered. "Then count again." He nodded because he could not speak. She hopped down, adjusted the strap, and marched up the walkway with her chin set toward music and away from everything else. When the door closed behind her, Adrian let his head fall back against the rest and finally inhaled all the way. The breath felt like dragging something heavy out of the water. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, insistent with the kind of concern that arrives as love disguised as irritation. "You good?" Maya had typed. He stared at it, thumb hovering, then wrote, "Yes. Eventually. We'll explain." He added a red heart and deleted it and replaced it with a period because punctuation sometimes knows what honesty weighs. He looked in the mirror and watched his own face for a moment as if it belonged to one of his patients. He checked for the signs he looks for in others: pupils reactive, breathing even, humor not totally gone, anger not spilling over. He exhaled and felt the place on his chest where rage had been pacing finally sit down like a dog told to wait. When the lesson finished, Naya came out with her mouth pinched like concentration had been hard work, which meant she had done well. She climbed in, buckled, and immediately started complaining about an open string that had squealed at her. He told her it would squeal less tomorrow because that is what practice does to mistakes when mistakes are treated with kindness and discipline. She considered that and let it stand. They drove past the spot where the florist had surrendered to dust and paper. The sign still said back in 10, and he wanted to laugh at how long 10 minutes could be. 2 turns later he saw the glint of a cruiser in a cross street, parked and harmless, A different officer scrolling on a phone in a way that made the man look human. His stomach still tightened. His hand still found the wheel a little higher, as if height could save him. At home, as they unbuckled, Naya pressed her palm to his. "Can I sleep with the light on tonight?" she asked, too casual, hoping to make it an easy ask by pretending it was nothing. "Yes," he said. "And you can steal my pillow." "Good," she said, and walked ahead, violin case knocking gently against her leg like a metronome. He watched her climb the steps and knew that this day would not fit in one chapter of their family story. It would echo in the small ways, how she looked at a uniform, how he slid his license onto the dashboard before any long drive, how the word please would sound in his ears when it came from the wrong mouth in the wrong moment. He also knew that nothing had broken that could not be named and worked on. Not fixed, not tied up, not made neat. Named and worked on. His phone buzzed again as he locked the car. A new message from an unfamiliar number glowed on the screen. "Dr. Cole, this is Sergeant Ramirez. For what it's worth, I'll be submitting an internal note about child presence stop protocol. I can't speak for outcomes. I can start with my own hands." He stared at the words and felt, for the first time since the blue lights, something that wasn't relief and wasn't joy. It was smaller and more stubborn. It was the feeling of a lever-finding purchase. Inside, Naya had already dragged his pillow into her room and was lining her toy horses along the baseboard. Each horse faced the door. She glanced up at him and then went back to her parade, a general who has decided how to guard the night. He leaned in the doorway and watched until his breathing matched hers. Downstairs, the strawberries in the Tupperware had turned soft at the edges. He ate one anyway and tasted a little summer clinging like a dare. His hands finally stopped shaking. He washed them in water hotter than necessary, then turned off the tap and stood very still in the quiet kitchen while the day replayed without permission. In the replay, one moment snagged harder than the others. Not the blue flash. Not the command. Not even the plea. The snag was smaller. It was the half-second when Riker looked at his own hand like he had never noticed it could be taught to do something else. Adrian dried his hands and pressed his palm flat on the cool counter. "Learn something else," he said to the empty room, not to the officer, not even to himself, but to the world that keeps setting the same test and wondering why the same answer shows up. Upstairs, an E string sang once, clear and clean, then wobbled into something imperfect and human. He smiled without meaning to, turned off the downstairs light and climbed toward it. The house breathed with him, not calm, not finished, but alive. The night after the stop felt like a second shift that none of them had agreed to work. The house was warm, the casserole in the oven smelled of thyme and garlic, but the air inside seemed to tremble, as though every wall had soaked in the tension from the curb and carried it indoors. Adrian sat at the kitchen table, still in his collared shirt with the hospital badge dangling from it like proof of a life he wasn't sure he'd been allowed to claim that day. Across from him, Maya's hands rested flat on the wood. Her nails dug lightly into the grain, not from anger but from the need to keep herself anchored. She didn't ask if something had happened, she asked what had happened, and she asked it with eyes that already knew the answer would make her throat tighten. He told her. He told her about the flicker of lights, the hand on the gun, the words he had chosen like sutures, precise, deliberate, meant to close a wound without making it worse. He told her about the trembling in Riker's hand, about the word please spoken in the wrong direction, about the way Naya had whispered each number as though counting could keep them both alive. Maya's face went pale in places and flushed in others. "He begged you?" she asked, disbelief and bitterness woven together. "He terrified our daughter, treated you like a suspect, and then begged you to spare him?" "Yes," Adrian said, because precision mattered. He begged not to lose his job. Not for forgiveness. Not even for understanding. Just his job. Maya leaned back, covering her mouth with her hand. She stayed like that for a long time, silent except for the sound of her breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier, but her words had teeth. "He gets to beg for his paycheck while you had to beg with your body language for your life. That isn't balance. That isn't justice." He reached across the table and set his hand on hers. "I know," he said, "but if I let Fury do all the talking, then I'm not any closer to making sure the next officer doesn't put his hand on his gun when he sees a black father with a child in the car. Maya's eyes softened, but her hand didn't release its grip on the wood. You're always trying to fix the whole system, she said quietly. Meanwhile, I'm just trying to fix the part of it that touched my family. They sat in silence then, listening to the oven tick as it cooled. Upstairs, Naya hummed the same crooked tune she'd been practicing earlier, the bow squealing across strings in fits and starts. The sound was imperfect, raw, but alive, and that was enough. When Adrian climbed the stairs later to check on her, he found her horses arranged in 2 lines facing each other across the carpet. She explained that one line represented the safe people and the other line the scary ones. She had positioned the smallest horse, a chipped white pony with a missing tail, between the 2 groups. This one doesn't know which side to stand on yet, she whispered, glancing at him. His chest tightened. He wanted to tell her the world wasn't that simple, that people couldn't be sorted into safe and scary with plastic toys. But he also knew she had seen enough that day to earn her categories. So he crouched beside her and picked up the tailless horse. Sometimes, he said carefully, the ones who start on the wrong side can learn to move. Do they stay there? She asked, her eyes wide with the weight of the question. Only if they keep listening, he said. And only if people keep reminding them where they should stand. She nodded, satisfied for now, and placed the horse back down. This time, she angled it slightly toward the safe side. Later, when Naya was asleep with her hand curled around the neck of her stuffed bear, Adrian sat alone in his study. The glow from his laptop screen painted him in pale blue light. He opened the complaint portal for the Police Accountability Board, typed his name, his address, and then stopped at the blank field labeled "Describe the incident." His fingers hovered. The clinical part of him wanted to lay it out like a case report. Male officer initiated traffic stop, hand resting on holster, escalated despite compliance, child present, unsolicited plea for leniency. That would be factual, accurate, admissible. But the father in him wanted to write, "My daughter watched a man with a badge teach her to fear me. She watched me shrink myself so we could both survive, and then she watched that man ask me to protect him instead. He tried both. Neither felt right on its own, so he let them merge." He wrote of the flashing lights, of the holster, of the trembling in Riker's jaw. He wrote of a little girl's whisper count, of the apology that came too late, of the plea that was not meant for her ears but reached them anyway. He wrote that the stop had not ended when he drove away, that it had followed them into their kitchen and her bedroom and would stay long after the officer's shift ended. When he clicked submit, the confirmation page gave him a number, case 24 to 317. The digits glowed sterile on the screen, and yet they felt like a stone he had placed in the foundation of something that might one day hold weight. The next morning, Naya asked if she could take his hospital badge to school for show and tell. The request startled him. "Why that?" he asked gently. "Because it proves who you are," she said, her voice solemn. "If someone doesn't believe you, I can show them." He swallowed hard and hugged her. "You don't need to carry proof for me," he whispered. "But if it makes you feel strong, then yes. Just bring it back safe." When she skipped out the door, clutching the lanyard like it was a shield, Adrian felt both proud and pierced. A child should not feel the need to carry evidence of her father's worth. And yet here she was, doing exactly that. At the hospital, Adrian moved through his shift with a composure that felt brittle at the edges. He treated a boy with a broken arm from a playground fall, a woman whose chest pain was more anxiety than artery, an elderly man whose confusion came from a forgotten dose of medication. He listened, diagnosed, reassured. And yet each time he bent over a patient, the echo of Riker's voice pressed into his ear, "Please. I have a kid on the way." By evening he was drained, not only from medicine but from the work of carrying 2 lives, the one his patients saw and the one his daughter had witnessed. That night, as he and Maya folded laundry together, she asked the question she had been circling all day. "Do you think he meant it?" "Meant what?" "The apology. The begging. Do you think it came from anywhere real?" Adrian thought about it for a long time, sorting socks into mismatched piles. "I think fear is real," he said finally. "I think he was afraid of losing his job more than he was afraid of what his hand on that holster did to us. But sometimes fear can open a door that guilt won't. Sometimes it's the only language a man knows at first. Maya shook her head. I don't care about his fear. I care about the fact that our daughter had to watch you become small enough to fit inside it. Her words landed like stones, not because they were cruel but because they were true. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers, and neither spoke for a while. The silence itself was its own kind of answer. In Naya's room, the horses had been rearranged again. This time all of them faced the door, lined up like a tiny army. The tailless one stood in the center. Adrian stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the formation, until he realized what it meant. His daughter had decided they all needed to stand guard. Even the broken one. When he finally turned off the hall light, the house sighed into darkness, but the sting of the day still lived in his chest. He lay beside Maya in bed, eyes open, listening to the quiet. He knew the story wasn't finished. It had only shifted into its next chapter, the kind of chapter where echoes linger, where children learn categories, where adults have to decide whether they will be remembered for their fear or for what they did after it. And as he closed his eyes, Adrian knew this. What haunted him most wasn't the plea itself, but the fact that his daughter had heard it too. She had learned in the span of one afternoon that even men with power could beg. And she had learned it not in a way that made the world safer, but in a way that showed her how fragile safety really was. He slept eventually, but the weight of that lesson pressed on his chest all night, heavier than any badge or any gun. The following Tuesday, Adrian walked into City Hall with his shirt collar pressed flat and his badge clipped to his breast pocket. He hadn't planned to wear the badge, but when he reached for his jacket that morning, Naya had handed it to him with a solemn nod, as if she were passing him armor. "Just in case they forget who you are," she said, sliding it onto his pocket like it was part of the uniform he needed to survive another day. Inside, the long hallway carried the kind of echo that made every footstep feel like a decision. The room where the Civilian Police Accountability Board gathered was not grand. Fluorescent lights hummed, and the carpet carried stains from coffee that had lived there longer than some of the members. But to Adrian, it always felt like the room where the city's pulse was measured. The board sat at a wide table, stacks of paper in front of them, the seal of the city printed on folders and letterheads. Adrian's chair was near the middle, his nameplate a small rectangle of black and brass. But when the session began, he stood. "Madam Chair," he said evenly, "for the record, I am recusing myself from any deliberation or vote concerning case 24-317. He heard the scratch of pens recording it in the minutes. He sat again, but the empty space he'd created by recusing himself stayed with him, as though he'd carved out part of himself and left it waiting at the edge of the table. The agenda moved with its usual mixture of dullness and urgency. Reports about overtime hours. Charts about recruitment numbers. Then, finally, the section marked discussion, pretextual stops, family impact. The words themselves looked harmless in print, but Adrian knew the story they hit could burn. The chair gestured to him. "Dr. Cole, you prepared remarks." He stood again, not as a physician now but as a father who had stood with his palms on the hood of his car while his child counted numbers to keep from screaming. "I want to speak about the gap between policy and reality," he began. "On paper, a stop for a signal violation or a taillight might seem minor. Routine. But nothing about a stop is minor when a child is in the vehicle. Nothing is routine about a hand on a holster when that hand is the first thing a child notices. My daughter didn't sleep through the night for 2 days because she kept replaying a stranger's posture in her mind." He paused, watching faces across the table. Some were unreadable, others softened by the weight of his words. "If we care about safety," he continued, "then we must admit that what children see at traffic stops will shape how they understand law, power, and fairness for the rest of their lives. If they learn to fear the people we tell them to trust, we are building a city where fear does the teaching." He let the words settle like dust. Then he added, "I will file my formal complaint as procedure requires. But I am also asking this board to move forward with the policy language we drafted months ago. Limit pretextual stops for minor equipment issues. Require narration and visible hands when children are present. Do not let the next family's evening turn into a lesson in survival." He sat down again, his hands folded so tightly in his lap that his knuckles ached. He didn't notice he was holding his breath until he exhaled and felt the weight slide off his chest. The room shifted. A council member asked about the data, how often these stops led to anything more serious. Another asked about liability. The union representative, Hal, who always arrived with a tie covered in small American flags, spoke of tying the hands of good officers and isolated incidents. His voice had a practiced rhythm, but even he glanced down at his notes when he mentioned isolated. Then a woman from the public comment section rose. She was in her late 50s, with a scarf wrapped twice around her shoulders. Her voice trembled but did not break. "I live on 3rd Street, she said. "I was the one who filmed." She held the microphone like it was heavier than it should have been. "I didn't know what would happen. I just knew there was a little girl in the car, and I thought, if this goes wrong, her mother deserves to know what happened." Her voice cracked then, and she covered it with a cough, but she pressed on. "I'm not proud of filming. I'm not proud that I didn't walk closer. But I thought maybe a camera could keep him safe." She gestured toward Adrian. "It shouldn't be that way. Cameras shouldn't be the only witnesses that matter." Her words left the room still. Adrian felt his throat tighten. He wanted to thank her, but his voice stayed locked in his chest. When the chair finally called the vote, the motion to move the draft policy forward passed 4-1. It was not law yet, but it was momentum. And momentum, Adrian knew, was sometimes the only thing that kept a city from rolling backward. During the recess, he stepped into the hallway. The building smelled faintly of bleach, the kind that never quite masked the older smell of sweat and paper. He sat on a wooden bench and rubbed his eyes. That was when he heard footsteps. When he looked up, Riker was standing there in a suit that looked borrowed, the shoulders too wide, the sleeves grazing his knuckles. His face was pale, and the circles beneath his eyes told of sleepless nights. "I shouldn't be here," Riker said quietly, looking down the hallway as if someone might catch him. "But I needed to say it. I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that makes things go away. The kind that admits I was wrong, that I saw you as something you weren't, and I made your daughter afraid of her own father." Adrian stared at him for a long moment. The words should have felt like balm, but they landed more like pebbles on water, disturbing the surface without reaching the bottom. "Do you know what she did, Officer Riker?" Adrian asked. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "She counted to 100 twice. Because she thought numbers might keep me alive. Do you understand what it means for a child to think math is armor?" Riker's mouth trembled. "I can't undo that," he whispered. "I know I can't. But I want to learn. I don't want to be the man who did that. If I get to keep this job, if they let me wear the badge again, I want to be forced to learn until I'm different. I'm asking you not to let me walk away from it unchanged." Adrian's heart thudded. He wanted to scream at him, wanted to shake him, wanted to ask why it had taken terror and exposure for him to see what other men saw every day. But he also saw something else, a face that wasn't hiding behind authority, a man who looked afraid of himself. "I can't promise you redemption," Adrian said finally. "That's not mine to hand out. But if you keep your badge, you will sit in a room I tell you to sit in. You will listen to children talk about fear. You will hear the way they describe the sound of a gun strap when it shifts. And you will not cry for yourself. You will not ask them for comfort. You will simply listen and you will learn." Riker nodded, quick and jerky. "Yes, I will." His eyes glistened. "Thank you." Adrian did not thank him back. He simply stood, nodded once, and walked back into the chamber, leaving the hallway heavy with the weight of words that were not enough but still had to be spoken. That evening at home, Adrian told Maya about the vote and about the hallway. She listened, arms crossed, her jaw set. "He came to you?" she asked, incredulous. "He had the nerve to come to you after what he put us through?" "Yes," Adrian said. "And he apologized." She shook her head. "Apologies don't erase fear. They don't erase what our daughter learned that day." "I know," he said softly. "But maybe, just maybe, they can change what his next stop looks like." Maya didn't answer. Instead, she went to the living room where Naya was arranging her horses again. Adrian followed. Tonight, The chipped pony stood at the very front, head tilted toward the door, as if daring whatever entered to face it first. Naya looked up at them, serious and small. "This one's brave now," she said. "Even without the tail." Adrian felt his chest tighten again. He crouched down beside her. "Sometimes the broken ones learn how to be brave," he said, his voice low. Naya smiled faintly, and for the first time since that afternoon, he saw a flicker of light return to her eyes. But when he kissed her goodnight later, and she whispered, "Will the policeman ever stop being scary?" he could only pull her close and answer, "I don't know. But we're going to keep trying to make sure he does." It wasn't a neat ending. It wasn't enough. But it was the truth, and truth was the only thing he could give her without making promises the world had no intention of keeping. And as he lay awake in the dark beside Maya, listening to the rhythm of his daughter's sleep down the hall, Adrian understood something he hadn't before. Justice wasn't a verdict or a policy or even a suspension. Justice, in its realest form, was whether his daughter would grow up believing the world could be better than the day she had already seen. That, he realized, was the work still left to do. Winter settled in with a slow weight. The trees along Oak Street stood stripped and skeletal, and the bakery that had once carried the smell of yeast and sugar was now boarded entirely, its windows sealed with plywood that rattled against the wind. For weeks after the hearing, Adrian felt as though his own ribs had been replaced with the same wood, patched over, rattling at every gust. He went to the hospital, he came home, he tucked Naya in and answered her questions about fractions, but inside, he carried the sound of that one word, "please," spoken by a man who should have never been allowed to use it as a shield. The board's decision had been handed down. Officer Riker suspended without pay for 30 working days, mandatory training, and a probationary period with close oversight. Some called it fair, others called it soft, and the truth lived uneasily somewhere between. For Adrian, it meant a man would wear a badge again, but with new rules stapled to his chest. It was not enough, but it was something. The sting came from watching his daughter try to understand it all. One Saturday afternoon, she sat cross-legged on the living room rug, lining up her toy horses as usual. But this time, she picked up the tailless one and held it in her hand for a long time. "Daddy," she said finally, "do you think the policeman is like this horse? He lost something, but maybe he can still be good." Adrian froze, folding the laundry in his lap without actually seeing it. He thought of how Riker had looked in that hallway, stripped of uniform, suit too big, begging not to be remembered as the man who made a child count for her father's life. He thought of the apology, the stammer, the fear that had cracked his face open. Then he thought of Naya's trembling voice, whispering each number like a prayer she had invented. "I think," Adrian said carefully, "that sometimes people can lose something and still learn how to be better. But it takes work. It takes more than saying sorry. It takes listening. And sometimes they don't do the work. Sometimes they stay broken." Naya tilted her head, considering. She set the tailless horse back down in the front row. "Then I'll make it practice more," she said, "until it learns." Adrian swallowed the ache in his throat and let her words hang there, because they sounded both too simple and too wise, the way children often do when they're trying to shape the world back into something that won't scare them at night. In January, the arbitration came. Predictably, the union lawyer argued the suspension was excessive, that Riker had shown remorse and demonstrated restraint by not escalating further. The arbitrators shaved the punishment down, 20 days instead of 30. Still suspended. Still training. Still stained. When Adrian read the ruling, his first reaction was not rage but weariness. He set the letter down and whispered to Maya, "They always find a way to soften the fall." She squeezed his hand but didn't argue. Both of them knew what the city liked to do with accountability, speak of it loudly, then hand it out quietly in smaller doses. Yet, beneath the fatigue, there was a different current. The new policy had already gone into effect. Pretextual stops for minor equipment violations had dropped by a quarter in just the first month. Officers were now required to narrate every action when a child was present. For the first time in years, Adrian had seen a sliver of proof that words written on paper could become rules that bent behavior. It was change, fragile and incomplete, but it had teeth. 2 weeks later, Adrian was leaving the hospital late when he saw him. Riker. Not in uniform, not behind the wheel of a cruiser, but standing in the lobby of the community center across the street, where the board had scheduled a listening session on children and policing. His shoulders were hunched, his jacket too thin for the cold, and he clutched a notebook in one hand like a lifeline. Their eyes met through the glass, and for a moment the air thickened. Riker looked down, then up again, then gave a small nod. Not defiant, not smug, just an acknowledgement, the way a man acknowledges someone who holds the mirror he's been forced to look into. Adrian did not nod back. He simply walked past, carrying the weight of the moment like a stone. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't hate. It was the strange middle ground where justice often camps. Not enough, but not nothing. That night, Naya asked him a question that landed like a stone dropped in water. "Daddy," she said from her bed, voice soft in the glow of her nightlight, "if the policeman gets better, does that mean I can stop counting?" The word stabbed. He sat on the edge of her bed, smoothed her hair, and looked into her eyes. "You don't have to count anymore, Bean," he whispered. "Not for me. Not for anyone. If you count, let it be for music, not for fear." She nodded, though her fingers twisted in the sheets. He kissed her forehead and walked out, but her question lingered in his chest like a bruise. Weeks turned into months. Spring tried to pry the city open with buds and birdsong. Yet, for Adrian, the stop never fully ended. It replayed in flashes, at a yellow light when he slowed and a cruiser pulled up behind him, at a parent-teacher night when a uniformed officer strolled the hallways, at the sound of a siren slicing the night air. The memory lived like a tenant who paid no rent but refused to move out. And perhaps that was the truest part of it. Justice had been served in ways that could be measured: suspension, training, policy shifts, but the cost could not be refunded. The complaint number might close one day. The file might get archived. But a child had learned to count as if numbers could save her father, and no arbitration could erase that lesson. On a rainy evening in April, Adrian sat with Maya at the kitchen table while Naya practiced upstairs. The notes of her violin drifted down, shaky but determined. Adrian sipped his tea and finally said what he had been holding back. "I don't think justice is ever going to feel clean," he said. "Not in this case, not in any case like it. We didn't get a neat ending. We got pieces. Some of those pieces are good, policy, training, accountability, but others," he trailed off, his hand clenching into a fist on the table. "Others just stay broken." Maya reached for his hand. "Maybe broken is where people finally start to pay attention," she murmured. He thought about that. Maybe she was right. Maybe broken things cut sharp enough that people finally notice the bleeding. And here is where the story must end, not with a bow, not with a slogan, but with the sting that reality leaves behind. A man with a badge begged for his job. A father kept his hands on the hood of his own car while his daughter whispered numbers like prayers. A policy changed, but a child's memory did not. That is justice in America. Not neat, not complete, but a push forward with splinters still lodged beneath the skin. So, to you listening, I will leave this question hanging. What would you have done in Adrian's place? What would you teach your child to remember, that apologies are enough, or that accountability must mean more than words? If this story stirred something in you, if it made you think about fear, power, and the fragile thread of dignity that holds families together, then don't let it stop here. Share this story so others can wrestle with it too. Subscribe if you want to keep hearing the stories that challenge comfort and demand we look closer. And like this video not because it is pleasant, but because it matters. Because justice should sting. And until it does, it will never last.